Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today, we're gonna go see what's on sale.
Every day's great at your Tunex.
Hello to all of our awesome listeners. Welcome back to the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. This is Arnie here, and I will be your host for tonight's episode. Just a quick reminder to everybody out there, if you enjoy the show and what we're doing here, please make sure you rate and review our podcast on iTunes or whichever platform you listen to us on. It always helps out a ton, and it helps new people discover the podcast, which is everything that we really want. Also, if you haven't already, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. So, tonight's topic is going to be an interesting one for many reasons, one of which being that we are, for the first time, missing two region-free gamer hosts from the show. So let me introduce the one other regular host with me. Paul, how are you doing today?
My name's Paul. I like video games. I'm happy to be the sole survivor.
We are missing Masa and Ozzy. Ozzy is currently, he has abandoned his post at the Region Free Gamers to backpack around Europe, and Masa, I believe, is currently lost among the fjords in Finland, if that's not inappropriate to say.
Those crazy fjords, man. They're just gobbling people up.
But luckily, we do have an awesome guest with us today, and that is Kelly, also known as Sierra Knight _ gaming on Instagram. How you doing, Kelly?
Hello, guys. I'm doing well today.
Yay. And before we get started, Kelly, I did want to ask, just for our listeners, why don't you give us a couple facts about yourself, just so they can get a sense of who you are?
Well, one thing about me is I have been a gamer for all of my life, and I'm going to date myself here, but I have been playing since the Atari 5200. My father put the controller in my hand when I was very young, and we played Pac-Man and we played Asteroids together, so I have been a gamer for my entire life. Awesome. Also, I love RPGs. JRPGs have been, like, the best thing for me for the last since I was probably in 6th grade is when I started playing those RPGs. And those rhythm games and visual novels are my top three genres for gaming.
Nice.
Hey, quick question. What's the first... Do you remember the first JRPG you played?
The first one was actually more of a adventure game, Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy. There were two guys in my class that were talking about this cool game that they had played, and I had never heard of it before. I had just got a Game Boy, and I only had 2 games for it, so I asked if I could borrow it from them. They let me borrow it from them, and I was just in love with the series from that point onward. Got all the Final Fantasy Legend games, switched over to Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, you name it. I just started purchasing all the ones that I could.
Nice.
It's funny, it's that first one that really kind of gets you.
It really is. Like,
man... Yeah, anyhow.
I mean, that is definitely true. You sort of never forget your first JRPG.
I know, it sounds a little bit ridiculous, but It's really true, right? Like, for anybody who likes that genre, when I ask that question, like, I can almost hear it in their voice, like, how much they light up talking about that very first one, and,
Absolutely.
How it goes on from there, yeah?
Yeah, I think for RPG fans in general, your first one is almost as important as your first video game, just period. Which is super appropriate for our topic today, because I gotta admit, very excited for this episode, and I think people who have listened to the show before will know why I'm very excited for this episode. I think it's mostly due to the fact that Ozzy and Masa are now gone, so I've been given the reins and the power to sort of have this episode and sort of fanboy for probably an hour and a half to 2 hours.
I know, right? Without Ozzy here to rein us in.
Oh
my
Lord, this is going to be great. But yeah, so we are talking about Persona 4. So let's, as I talk about this game, I just want to make clear that I'm currently holding my personal copy. And I turned it over and I realized I'd never noticed this before, but the back of the box has a tagline that says "Tune in, turn on, and drop dead." And that sounds like more aggressive than I ever remember.
I know, right?
This game
That's not what I think of when I think of Persona 4. I think of like, delightful characters and lots of bright, vivid colors, not necessarily dropping dead.
No, just drop dead. Just this game does not even care. But I think with that, we're just gonna dive right in. And for the uninitiated, I will have a brief segment here on what Persona actually is. So Persona is a sub-series of a Japanese RPG developed and published by Atlus, the main series being Shin Megami Tensei. It's the umbrella franchise under which Persona exists. That series began with Digital Devil's Story Megami Tensei, which was released in September 11th of 1987 for the Nintendo Famicom. We did not get that game. We did not get several of the Megami Tensei games. In fact, and I just learned this through research, the first Shin Megami Tensei game to come to the West was 1995's Jack Brothers on the Virtual Boy, which
oh my god,
was a real eye-opener for me, to think that such an influential JRPG series of the modern age started life off as a Virtual Boy game here in the West. Like, that was the first sort of step that Atlus took into the Western market with their franchise. And obviously Jack Bros is sort of a spin-off title. It's not a main RPG entry point into the series. That would happen with Revelations Persona, which was released on the original PlayStation in 1996. Since then, Persona has obviously become the most popular sub-series of the Shin Megami Tensei franchise. I think at this point it's safe to say obscuring the main franchise itself by quite a large margin. I think that most people's interaction with Shin Megami Tensei games comes from Persona. If not exclusively, then that was probably one of the first games they played in the series. The series was initially not super huge series in the West, but that sort of changed with the release of Persona 3, which was a huge commercial and critical success for Atlus, and obviously paved the way for this little gem that we're going to be talking about today. But yeah, so I think the first thing that I wanted to get from you guys is, do you remember when you first played Persona 4, and what did you think of it when you initially started playing it?
Kelly, why don't you start us off?
Well, for me, I actually had the game pre-ordered. So I had just played Persona 3 the summer before Persona 4 came out. So as soon as I finished that one, I knew I needed to play the sequel. So I had it pre-ordered, got it the day of release, and unfortunately, my disc didn't work. There was actually a small batch of discs that did not work for Persona 4 at release. So I had to go back to GameStop, get a different copy. They apologized by giving me they didn't have any pre-order art books the day that the game released, but they did when I went back. So they gave me the pre-order art book, went home, started playing. Loved the game. I mean, I know a lot of people say it starts slow. There's like 3 hours of story with no fighting. But for me, just having that world building, seeing that world inside the TV, everything was just amazing. So yeah, I loved it right from the start.
That's awesome. What about you, Paul?
It would have been about 4 years ago or something like that. I'd kind of not been playing video games for a little while, just because I was training for a career change, and then my wife and I had just moved to the Yukon, and I was training for my job here. I just didn't really have too much time or frankly desire for video games. But once life kind of settled down, I had this Persona 4 game on the PS2 that I had owned for a long time. I bought it on the strength of an article that I read. I think the title of the article was it was something generic, like the JRPG you have to play or something like that, right? Yeah. But from the author's description, I was like, wow, it was so great. So great that I didn't play it for 5 or 6 years. but regardless, I had kind of fallen out of the habit of playing games and enjoying them. And so once life kind of settled down here, I popped it in the PS2. I'm like, well, I'll give this a try. We'll play for, half an hour each day. And it's just like Kelly said, like I was enthralled almost right from the beginning. It was unlike any JRPG that I had played before, the world building was very detailed. The modern setting was very appealing, you know, because I can only play Final Fantasy so many times, and I have played Final Fantasy so many times, right? And obviously, like, the art style was so bright and modern, and you know, bearing in mind too that this is like 7 years after it was released, it still has that sharp modern feel to it. And yeah, I was hooked. You know, I played it for a little bit each day over the course of maybe 3 to 6 months. I don't remember exactly, probably closer to 6 if I'm being honest. And it was great. Like, it is the game that got me back into this hobby that I had kind of let fall by the wayside. So yeah, what can I say? Great game, very important to me.
Yeah, and I mean, listening to you both talk about it sort of reminds me of the way it was for me, because I feel the same way about the game. For me, I guess it's my turn to date myself. I picked this up summer of 2009, I believe, which was the year I graduated from high school. So it was my first summer out of high school. And I think, I don't know if due to that, but this game's story and characters definitely resonated with me a lot, and it was very impactful. I got the game based off of some online reviews I had seen, just for the series in general. So I went to my local GameStop trying to find, you know, either Nocturne or 3 or 4, and this just happened to be the one that was available at the time. I believe I bought it new.
Nice. Lucky.
Yeah. at like $30 or something like that. It wasn't full price when I ended up picking it up. And I loved it from the second I put it in. Like Kelly said, you know, it's one of these games that starts off slow. But I wouldn't say that it starts off slow as a negative. It sort of takes you along and sort of make sure that you understand the world that it's trying to set you in before you sort of get to explore it on your own. There's a lot of setup, there's a lot of build up to a lot of the mysteries that are introduced very early on in the game, but I think it does it in such an effective way. The writing in this game is very strong, so I was immediately hooked. I spent my entire summer just barreling through it, and I loved every second of it. So,
and it probably helps too that you were a little bit younger. Like, it actually, I think it's one of the game's strengths actually that me playing it as a 35, 36-year-old, and it's a bunch of Japanese high school students, but like, if I was, I mean, first of all, it was, I really identified well with the characters. I really liked them, and which speaks to how well written they are, that, you know, a creaky old man could actually enjoy what was going on there, right? But let me tell you, man, if I was a teenager and I'd played this game, good God, like, this would have been the greatest thing I had ever experienced.
Yeah, and I mean, at the time, I was sort of in the same boat as you were. I had sort of fallen out of video gaming quite a bit. I still played video games and I enjoyed them, but they weren't a main sort of focus for me for a few years at that point, and this game just sort of yanked me right back in there in the worst way. You know, after playing this, I was, you know, head over heels, just like, I need to get more. I need to find more of these games. So, you know, my introduction to Shin Megami Tensei as a series, and sort of reignited my passion for video gaming in general. You know, and this seems to be a game that's done that for a lot of people. This seems to be the one of the series that people remember the most fondly, as far as I've experienced so far. But just getting a little bit further into it, as we'd mentioned before, and as Kelly mentioned, this followed Persona 3, which was also released on the PS2, I think maybe 2 or 3 years before this one. And, you know, if you've played a Persona game, there are definitely some common themes that run through a lot, if not all, of the mainline Persona games. Set in Japan, usually high schoolers are the cast of characters involved, and you use your personas, who are basically demons that you can recruit and then fuse to create larger and stronger demons. Nothing sort of groundbreaking, at least not by the time it made it over here to the West. I think that we had seen other games where you sort of battle through proxies and do all the fusing and stuff like that. But Persona just did it in a more engaging way, in my opinion. And it always kept combat very engaging and very, sort of fun. And I think one of the things that really hit home for me when I played this, and I'd like to get you guys' opinion on this, but this was sort of the first RPG that I played that sort of really loved the Japanese-ness of its setting. It was like the most sort of RPG that was willing to explore the fact that it was set in Japan and it was Japanese. I feel like a lot of RPGs, especially when they were moved over to the West, as far back as the NES, Super Nintendo era, they tried to sort of take that out of a lot of these games. Whereas this game, I feel like, really enjoyed that and really had fun showing people, like, you're in a rural town in Japan and this is what high school is like in Japan and this is what, eating in Japan is like, and, shrines and high school and doing all that cool stuff. Was it that way for you guys as well, Kelly?
Definitely. I mean, just having that modern day setting as well. Just, you have cell phones, you have just cars, everything. It's not in a fantasy setting anymore. It's real world. So it just makes it a lot more, you can relate to it a lot more because, hey, I've done this, or, oh, I've seen this on an anime, the Japanese culture was great, and just bringing that to the world to see the differences between the different countries. It was great.
Yeah. What about you, Paul?
I couldn't agree more. It was the first game I had played as well that was just unapologetically Japanese, right? It really, there was, like, I can't think of a thing in that game, and I mean, look, I wasn't keeping track or anything, but I can't think of a thing in that game that they tried to Americanize. Like, I think my favorite example in that game is the kotatsu. So, for those of you who don't know, the kotatsu is this thing that's used almost exclusively in Japan. It's basically like a large coffee table, and covering the coffee table is a comforter, and underneath the table there's a heater. So in the winter, everybody gets together and they sit around the kotatsu, they cover themselves with the blanket, and then they turn on the heater. And, like, I had never heard of anything like that. And quite frankly, I don't think it would have been that much of a stretch for them to replace the kotatsu with, whatever the case may be, right? Just pick any kind of North American gizmo and throw it in there. Yeah. But, instead, Nanako loves her kotatsu. Yep. And I thought that was awesome. Like, to the point where, and I mean, it's cold where I live. I want a kotatsu. And I still think about, like, kind of, building one myself. I think it'd be kind of fun.
Even the fact that they kept it as a kotatsu and they didn't, change it to, like, the electric blanket that we sit around as a family,
Even better. Yeah, that's an excellent point. The fact that they continued to call it the kotatsu and not something like an electric table blanket, Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Arnie. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I think, and I've said this before, so I don't mean to harp on this point, but it was sort of an introduction to a lot of this Japanese culture, and sort of aspects of Japanese life that people really seem to enjoy now. And this was the first game that I saw that sort of reveled in that and wasn't afraid to sort of show that stuff. And so, actually, speaking of, I did have a fun fact for this episode that I did not realize, but was very entertaining to myself. And that was that I didn't realize that Atlas developed and published the game in Japan and North America, but in Europe, the game was actually published by Square Enix, and in Australia, it was published by Ubisoft. And the vision in my mind of a Ubisoft logo plastered on the front of a Shin Megami Tensei game was endlessly entertaining to me. I don't know why. I don't know why. It's just like the people I least associate with Japanese RPGs is Ubisoft.
It is a little bit ridiculous, and if left to their own devices, Ubisoft would have released 5 the next year, and then 6 the year after that, and, and so on and so forth.
As an open world game set in like the Caribbean.
Yeah, Persona 8, Modern Warfare or whatever.
Oh, Lord. The game was directed by Katsura. I'm going to butcher these, by the way. So apologies to all of our listeners, just front and center. But the game was directed by Katsura Hashino, who also directed other Shin Megami Tensei games like If, and Devil Summoner, where he was a designer. He worked on Nocturne, Digital Devil Saga, Persona 3, Persona 4, Persona 5, and Catherine, all as director. And he did Machina X on the Dreamcast. So he's been working closely with Atlus for many, many years. And I think that he is instrumental in bringing sort of what we know as the style of Persona that I think really started with 3, and has carried over through 4 and through 5. I would say that he is probably one of the most instrumental people in sort of bringing that to the games and sort of crafting the way that we think about Persona games in the modern sense. So now that we've sort of gone through some of the basics for people who might not be as familiar with the game as we are, I think it's fair to start to actually dive into Persona 4 itself. And this is where I think we need to start off talking about the setting of the game. So the game is mainly set in the small rural town of Inaba. Usually, at least when I think of games, setting is not necessarily that important, especially when we're talking about giant, sprawling fantasy RPGs where you travel to, different lands and towns and continents. But with something like Persona 4, where everything is set in and around this tiny town, I think that the setting takes on such an important role that it becomes a character unto itself. So I wanted to get your guys' takes on what did you think of Inaba as a setting for a game like this? So I want to start with Paul this time. What did you think of this setting while you were playing this game?
Well, you kind of hit it there, buddy. Like, it's not like anything I ever saw before, right? Most RPGs that you play, like, especially as the years have gone by, everything is just bigger, bigger, more sprawling, more places to explore. And then suddenly you have Persona 4 and it's just like this tiny little town in Japan. And it brings a charm of its own and makes it a lot more intimate, because you're there the entire game. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And even though it's in Japan, like, it has a lot of the modern small town problems that, I don't want to say plague, but that, North American towns and cities deal with. The fact that, Juness, which is sort of the Walmart equivalent, comes to town and starts putting the little shops on Main Street out of business. They don't spend a lot of time talking about that. But they don't need to. It's there to add that realism, even if it's kind of sad. It's there to add that flavor, and there are tons of little touches like that I really just kind of think make it more vibrant and real than a large, sprawling, Bethesda game, for example.
Absolutely. What about you, Kelly? What did you think of Inaba and just the setting of the game as in general?
Inaba, I think, was, for this game, it needed to be a very small town. You have a murder that happens right at the beginning in a huge, sprawling city that might not be as big of a deal as it was to this little tiny town. So Absolutely. It was just, you really needed that little intimacy, this community feel, to have that be such a shocking thing for all our characters. So just having that small town was a great thing to explore, just to have that small town there.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I hadn't really considered before, but that makes perfect sense. The fact that when these things start to happen, it's such a small town that it's going to get around. Everybody's going to know, and it's obviously more likely to impact you. And as a character in that town, if you're in a setting like this where it's small, and I think one of the things that Persona 4 does really well is that it takes this tiny town and just makes you sort of explore every single inch of it through interactions with other, residents of the town and obviously your friends and the mystery that's going on. But you do so much in this town, and you really get a sense, at least I did, that you are part of the daily life of this town, to the point where when I finished the game, I didn't want to leave. I grew like attached. I was like, oh, I'm part of this now. I live here now. And that's a feeling that I don't often get with RPGs, even nowadays. Honestly, even with other Persona games. So this has definitely been one of the better settings for a JRPG that at least comes to my mind in the modern sense. But so, just getting an overview of our story, you are the protagonist. He is unnamed in the actual games, but I'll be calling him Yu. That is his name in the animated adaptation of the video game. He arrives in a fictional town, the rural town of Inaba, where you're going to be living with your uncle and your cousin, for the next year. I believe that your parents are on some sort of business trip or something like that. It's not very well explained, but it's your typical transfer student story. So all things considered, game starts out not doing a whole lot of original things. But it slowly grows into something a lot more insane. Obviously you begin attending high school shortly thereafter, and you meet, your first few friends, Yosuke, Yukiko, and Chie. Throughout your interactions, as Kelly has mentioned, a murder is committed, and that sort of sets off the chain of events that will unfold throughout your adventure in Inaba. And obviously, just off the bat, the fact that it's something so simple as like, you're in a small town and it's like somebody's been murdered. They don't start off on the fantastical just yet. They sort of make it seem like it's going to be very grounded and down to earth. Obviously, for somebody who's played other Persona games, as Kelly has, I'm sure that she knew, that something was up, and things would change. But for me, I was like, oh, so is this going to be like, I'm just a couple of kids like hanging around town trying to solve murders? That sounds pretty cool.
It's like Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, exactly. And then all of a sudden you wake up in a dream and you're in like a limousine with an old bald man, and you're like, oh, okay, this is like taking a turn now. But no, so, and as we'll discuss going forward, obviously things change and you discover the power of personas, which are these, I guess, proxies that fight for the characters. They're a reflection of a character's inner self, in the disguise or visage of kick-ass monsters, because that's the only way that, people want to imagine that their inner self is. I'd like to imagine that my inner self is like a giant towering demon that would fight for me. So I really enjoyed that. And, as you sort of dive into the mystery of the town, you start discovering that there is a world inside of televisions. And I promise this makes a whole lot more sense in the actual game. But essentially what is happening is that somebody has gained access to a world that is hidden within televisions, and they are kidnapping and throwing people into the television world, where they are eventually attacked by creatures known as shadows. And being murdered, which is why their bodies end up back in the real world after a certain amount of time. You discover that you have the ability to enter this television world, so you form an investigation team with your friends to solve the mystery, and find out who is behind the murders in Inaba. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack in the story of Persona 4, and I do not imagine us sort of going through the story beat by beat and trying to explain that. One, because it'd take 17 hours, and two, because it would ruin the experience. I would never do sort of a deep dive on something like Persona, because I think something that we can all agree on is that the strength of this game, it lies within its story. Absolutely. Within its character, within the sort of mystery that unfolds. So I think the way we're going to structure this episode is we're going to talk about the individual characters that make up the investigation team, and through them give a little bit of an overarching view of the story, give our opinions on certain aspects of the story and the writing, and I think that's how we're going to approach this.
And I don't think we can be spoiler free here, just as a heads up.
Oh yeah, absolutely not.
Like that's not possible.
No.
But with that said, we're not gonna, it's like you said, we're not gonna go beat by beat through the story.
No. That is for much more talented people with much more time than I currently have.
One thing I will mention though about the TV world and so on, like you were mentioning in the setting and the setup and all that. That TV world is like it's such a kind of perfect representation of the urban legends that we kind of shared as teenagers and so on. I thought it was brilliant. The fact that you have this thing that is, it is essentially an urban legend. Like the way the kids talk about it. Oh, there's this world, the Midnight Channel. If you tune in at midnight, you'll see, I don't know, I can't even remember what it is. Yep. Your soulmate? Seriously?
Yes.
Oh man, that's like the opposite of what it actually is.
You have to tune in. You have to stare at your TV turned off on a rainy night, if I'm not mistaken, and it will show you your soulmate.
Yeah, which is, super creepy and but it's like the same, right? It's kind of the same. Like when I was a kid, we used to did you guys ever stare into the mirror?
Yep.
And like say Bloody Mary?
Yep.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what I mean, right? It was really cool seeing, these teenagers talk about this urban legend, tune into the TV at midnight. It really took me back. It was really cool.
Yeah. And I agree for sure. Like it's definitely something that the way it's set up is very intriguing because you just hear about it. Obviously, that it's going to come up at some point. But to turn it from what it's initially pitched as, which is a way to find your soulmate, and sort of realizing that no, it's actually the victims of the serial murderer who's running around the town, is a nice little play. Because I sure as hell was not expecting that to happen when I started playing this game. It's sort of like I think we discussed before, there's a slow burn to get to the actual meat of the story, but once you get there, it starts taking a lot of twists very quickly. But I think before we dive into the characters, we're going to take a small little break, so we'll see you on the other side. All right, and we're back. Thank you guys so much. So, deep dive. Let's start off with some of these characters. We've already talked about Yu a little bit, and there's not much to say because he's a protagonist. He is mostly a silent protagonist throughout the entirety of the story. His deal is that as a protagonist, he is able to control more than one persona at a time. All your other characters have assigned personas, but Yu is able to wield a variety of personas that you can sort of fuse and play with in different ways, creating the main battle mechanic of the game. I guess the only thing I really want to talk about with Yu relates directly to this mechanic. And I think I want to start with Kelly this time. Is this something, I know you had played Persona 3, so I think you have some experience with the battle mechanics for Persona 4. I mean, with the Persona series in general, just the use of the demons and the fusing and stuff like that. But how does this game compare to Persona 3 in terms of just the amount of stuff that's in it and how it chose to go about executing that combat?
The combat in 4 was much improved over Persona 3. I played the PS2 version of Persona 3, which basically in that version, you only had control over your protagonist. The other ones were on they had an AI system, so you couldn't control their attacks. They would just attack however they wanted. So there is, I'm sure there's still a few memes out there basically stating that there was one character that all she would do was try to charm the enemies. She would have the weakness, she would have the elemental weakness for the enemy, but instead she would try to charm them every single time.
Yep.
By the way, probably my number one historical pet peeve in RPGs in general is the AI controlled. Yeah. Like, it's got to be the number one.
Absolutely. That's probably the main reason I've never finished Persona 3, is I just can't stand it.
They did change it for the PSP version. So in the PSP version, they did improve upon that. But the animation and everything else was kind of cut back to get it onto the portable system. So with Persona 3, I always say you've got to pick and choose to get the best version. For Persona 4, I can seriously say that Persona 4 Golden is the definitive version, but for Persona 3, you have to go back and forth between the two to decide what you want. Do you want the female protagonist, or do you want to have the after story? So, yeah. But the battle mechanics too, just crazy.
Yeah. So, you know, like you said, it seems like it was improved. Battle mechanic wise, for me, this was the first time I was ever dealing with this. So the sort of the weakness, the elemental stuff, which is sort of rock, paper, scissors, was really cool. I enjoyed it because it was simple enough that it was easy to learn. But you still had to sort of watch out because certain enemies have certain weaknesses, but you also have certain weaknesses depending on which personas you're wielding. So sometimes enemies could come in and destroy you if you weren't, you know, on your guard. So it was a system that was very easy to learn, but still kept that sort of pressure and kept you on your toes, even against like weak enemies, quote unquote. Very not as unforgiving as Persona 3, but still very engaging and super interesting. Did you have any experience with combat mechanics like this before, Paul?
I mean, yes and no, because I had played the 2 Devil Survivor games on the Nintendo DS, so you know there's a lot of the rock paper scissors in that one, and a lot of the Persona Fusion in that one as well. But obviously, it's a tactical RPG. I say obviously, like everybody has played this game that's relatively obscure, but as like your straight up turn-based JRPG, no, I hadn't quite touched anything like that before. Also nice because it had that, which is kind of starting to become, you know, more common now, I guess is the only way I can describe it, which is the stretch goal for not just winning, but like winning really well, where you get extra experience and extra gold.
Yeah.
You know, that it wasn't the first time I had played a game like that, but man, oh man, when you're doing hundreds of those kind of, not random battles, because you see the enemies in this one, but when you're doing hundreds of battles, it really, really helps also to have that little extra thing to strive towards other than just not dying, which is generally pretty easy.
Absolutely. I guess the only other thing I want to touch on with you is that he is a silent protagonist, which is not necessarily new in the world of RPGs. But do either of you wish that he wasn't a silent protagonist? Do you wish that he had more of a story and his own agency, Kelly? Did that ever bother you?
It did not. I actually liked him being the silent protagonist, the blank slate, the insert character. Just basically you could make your own character out of it. When he appeared as you in the spin-offs and in the animation, it didn't feel like my protagonist. I wanted to romance Rise. Instead, he was, you know, friend to everyone. I was just like, that's not my protagonist. Mine is named Mikhail, and he is in my game. So.
Yeah, I think that I completely agree. I think a lot of people, you know, seem to have issues with silent protagonists. I think more so now than before. I think before it was sort of a limit of what they could do in terms of, having your character do all this stuff. But I think that in a game like this, where story is so important, I think having a character where you can sort of put your own spin on it and sort of insert yourself into their shoes makes for a much more effective storytelling mechanic than if he was a defined character who had, defined story from beginning to end instead of making the story your own. What do you think, Paul?
I agree. I mean, I'm fine with him being silent because, and you know what else it does is it makes the kind of dating sim effect, or it makes the dating sim elements more effective.
Yeah.
Because you're kind of putting yourself into this character. And so when you're talking to the various girls in the game, like, it sounds so cheesy, right? Like, especially as an older man, but, but like, you're getting to know Yukiko and you're getting to know Chie, and it's like, well, who do I want him/me to be with in the game?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Whereas if he was a meteor character and not just kind of a reflection, then I don't know, I give less of a shit, right?
Yeah.
Because he's this guy and whatever. Like, I kind of agree with you in that, in theory, it would put a ceiling on where they could take the story, based on the fact that they have this character who's just a blank slate.
Mm-hmm.
But it conversely really adds something in that you can totally project yourself onto the character, which I think is a storytelling mechanism, obviously, that's very unique to video games.
Yeah.
So, why not have that in there and see how it works? I mean, geez, man, if I was a teenager, I would totally want to be this dude, right? But it's true, and I could have the character behave in that way, however I wanted him, within limits, of course, right? To behave. So, yeah, I think it's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. But so, pushing our protagonist aside, we, I think, need to talk about the first person we meet in Inaba, and arguably, I guess, Yu's best friend, even though I didn't really care for him that much. To each his own. But that is Yosuke Hanamura. He is, like I said, the first party member you will meet. He is a high school classmate of Yu's, and I think, interestingly enough, he is also a transfer, so he's not an Inaba local. He came to Inaba a year before you. His father is the manager of the Junes department store, which is, as Paul had mentioned earlier, is sort of the Walmart or large chain store conglomerate that is coming to the small town and putting a lot of the mom and pop shops out of business. And that plays into his story. What we're going to see moving forward is that the way that these characters acquire their personas is when they enter the television world, they are forced to encounter their shadow, which is a negative reflection of their inner self. So what happens with Yosuke is he receives his persona after he and you enter the TV world to investigate the death of a girl whose name is Saki Konishi. She was a girl that Yosuke was interested in and whose family owned a liquor store, that Junes ended up putting out of business. Basically, Yosuke is confronted with a shadow, which is a representation of his resentment to living in a small town and wishing for exciting things to happen. Which I think is very understandable, and very relatable in the sense that, when you move from, somewhere where you've grown up and you've known a bunch of people and you have your friends, especially as a younger person, moving is hard. And that sort of isolation that people feel when they move, is reflected very well in Yosuke. I think, the fact that I don't like him doesn't make him an interesting character. So I thought that starting off, this was something I'd never seen before. So when I got this, like, a couple hours into the game, I was blown away. Like, the sort of stuff they were talking about, especially as somebody who had been through similar stuff, was very powerful, and I'd never seen something like this in a video game before, so I thought it was incredible. What about you, Paul? Did this have an impact on you when you were first going through the game?
Yeah, and I think maybe you and I have different opinions on Yosuke. I thought he was great, and I thought he also served another purpose, which is that if of all the characters in this game, Yosuke is going to be the one who is the most like the main target audience for the game, right? The target audience for most games is teenage boys, right? And obviously you're going to have girls playing and you're going to have adults playing and so on and so forth. But the people with infinite time who really want to is mostly going to be teenage boys. And so you have Yosuke, who I think is the most like that target audience and really serves a purpose as sort of being not necessarily a positive role model, but as a guy who, even though he's a little bit annoying and quite nerdy and so on, he still manages to, I don't know how, he manages to dress really well and have really great friends of both sexes. And it's kind of like and I've mentioned this before on the show and to you guys, it's kind of the Star Trek Next Generation effect, where you have these characters who aren't all cool. You know, Geordie LaForge was never the ladies' man, but Geordie LaForge also had a lot of really good friends in a very welcoming and warm environment. And I think that's kind of the great purpose that Yosuke serves in this story.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Kelly? Do you have any thoughts on Yosuke as a character?
Honestly, he was probably one of my least favorites. Typical best friend type. He got taken out of my party pretty quickly. Sorry.
His emotional trauma had no impact.
No.
I have no time for you. But yeah, so basically once confronted with this aspect of his personality, Yosuke initially rejects it, causing it to, as you would expect, become a giant, like, spider-looking demon. Because, of course, that's what needs to happen.
Sure.
You fight it, and something that I think is very powerful is the personas, especially for your characters. I think it's less impactful on you because, as we've said, he has multiple personas. But once you've defeated the shadow, the fight isn't really over, because the character has to accept that part of themselves. And that's what sort of makes them become their personal personas, is when you accept these negative traits that you sort of try to keep hidden away from other people. Like I said, this is sort of very heady stuff, especially for me, as a 17-year-old at the time. This was not something that I was used to games addressing and talking about. These sorts of topics, I felt like, while stuff like this might have been dealt with in other games, I felt like it was always behind the veneer of, the high fantasy setting or the, alien planet or, something like that. But this is just like very direct. These are kids in the world dealing with problems that kids have, adults, anybody can have these sorts of feelings. And the fact that they didn't try to sort of mask the moral of the lesson, was very, like, striking to me, especially in a Japanese RPG of all things.
Right.
But that's Yosuke. So Yosuke sort of, I mean, he because he's the first character, he becomes a part of your party fairly quickly. There's no big dungeon designed for Yosuke. But as Paul said, he is a main focus through a lot of the story. And I will admit, even though much like Kelly, Yosuke was not part of my party for very long at all. But he is probably one of the characters that, even if you don't like him, I think he will endear himself to you because you will be with him for this entire story. Aside from you, he is the party member that you probably have the most interactions with just in general. So following Yosuke, we meet Chie Satonaka, another classmate of Yu's, a longtime resident of Inaba. She has two interests that are fairly explicitly laid out, and those are red meat and kung fu. And I can get behind both of those things. Both of those things are good in my book. So 2 positives already out the way. She finds out about the TV world along with you and Yosuke, but she is very hesitant to enter the TV world until another character that we're going to talk about, Yukiko, who is her best friend, gets kidnapped and thrown inside the television world. Chie is a little bit more interesting than Yosuke in my mind. When she confronts her shadow, it basically represents her jealousy of her friend Yukiko's more feminine side, her talents, and the attention that she gets, but also her desire to want to control Yukiko, because it sort of makes her feel good to know that somebody like her depends on her so much. Which again, this isn't something that I'd experienced before. So this was, by the time I'm getting to this character, I'm like, okay, this game is just going to be a barrage of like emotional, storytelling like this constantly, which made me super intrigued. Kelly, do you have, what do you think of Chie?
Chie, well, first off, her voice changed from the original to Persona 4 Golden, so that was really jarring for me. I just got so used to the one in the original. So we'll just talk about the original one here. And she just, her friendship with Yukiko, being able to admit that she was jealous of her. She was a tomboy. You have your friend that's the really traditional Japanese girl. It was just nice to have that difference between the two of them, that they were still friends. And one thing I didn't mention with both Yosuke and Chie is that because you had that silent protagonist, it seemed like these two were the driving personalities of the game. They were the ones that drove the game because you had to have that silent blank slate in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you said, having the playoff between Chie and Yukiko, I will admit, the characters in Persona 4, on the surface, boil down to stereotypes. Yosuke is the funny nerd, Chie is the tomboy, Yukiko is the more feminine, girly girl, and so on and so forth. But once you actually get into their stories, there's layers to these characters. And that's what I think makes it super interesting. Paul, did you have any thoughts on Chie?
Best girl,
Hell
first
yeah.
of all.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I can see where you're going with this, Kelly, but we'll get there soon. Yeah, no, it's like you said, Arnie, the amount of depth for these characters is remarkable, and several orders of magnitude more than I'd seen in any game up to that point. Like one of the charming things about the characters in this game that you just don't find in other RPGs, let alone whether it's Japanese developed, Western developed, whatever, they are very, very vulnerable. Yeah. And they show that through going into the TV world and confronting their insecurities and so on. It really, really shows them to be very vulnerable, very realistic, and very identifiable, right? All these characters in this game, we'll get to Kanji eventually. I can't really identify with Kanji myself, but that's a whole other ball of wax. Yeah. Or Naoto, for example, right? But just the fact that they're going through these things and a lot of us share these insecurities with them, I'd never seen that in any kind of game before. It's absolutely remarkable. And with Chie, she's the tomboy. She enjoys her physical hobbies, but, Yukiko's the one who's getting the attention from the boys, and she feels insecure about that. This is all, I can't imagine how many thousands and thousands of people identify with this kind of thing. Being friends with someone who gets more attention from the opposite sex, right? It sucks. Yeah. But, she battles through and she accepts it. And, much like the rest of the characters do throughout the game, really positive message, really deep, vulnerable characters. And I think hers is really kind of the first one where it hit home for me. Yosuke, he moved to a new town. He's kind of, left out a little bit. He's the son of the manager of the business that's kind of destroying the town a little bit. But Chie was the one that really kind of hit home first. And I was like, wow, this is remarkable.
Yeah. And I think, and I'd like to see if you guys agree with me, because I could just be talking out of my ass at this point. But the fact, one of the other things that really struck me about Persona 4 is the way that it's set up the story, right? Because before this, my experience was, with your Final Fantasies, your Dragon Quests, your, those types of RPGs, your Chrono Triggers, where there's very early on, there is an established evil, an established antagonist, an established bad guy that you are directly confronting. But in Persona 4, there really isn't. Obviously, there's somebody committing these murders, but you don't know who that person is. There's just this nebulous sort of world that you're sort of trying to piece together as the game is sort of feeding you this information. So for a lot of the early game, especially when you're going through this with your characters, like, this is the main conflict. It's, what are these characters going through right now? What do they have to confront? As you sort of find other characters, what are they going to have to deal with? What are their experiences like? And I think not having the distraction of having, such a big bad that you're sort of looking forward to really helps the player sort of sit there and look at these things and focus in on each of these issues. And I think it helps the game address these issues a lot more effectively than if, you had your standard sort of narrative setup for a lot of these JRPGs from before and during this time as well. Obviously not everything is different. You, for the most part, is kind of played as like the perfect person. He doesn't really have to confront any issues, which I accept only because as a silent protagonist, if they put an issue for him to confront, I don't think it would have resonated as much with the player because you're supposed to be that person and they can't come up with an issue that'll be, relatable to every single person who plays this game.
Yeah, the only way he'd be able to fight it is with his stoicism.
Exactly. Just blank stare it to oblivion. So moving on from Chie, we come to, obviously, Yukiko. And Yukiko, much like Chie and Yosuke, is another classmate of Yu's and everybody else's. They're all in the same grade. Yukiko, unlike Chie, is obviously the popular girl. She's a little bit more introverted than Chie is. Her background is that her parents own an inn, a historic inn that has been in Inaba for a very long time, and she's being groomed to take over that inn after her parents pass away. She is the first member of what would eventually become the investigation team or the main party to be thrown into the TV world by the person who's committing these crimes. Which means that it's dungeon time. She is the first sort of main dungeon that you go through in this game, unless I'm forgetting something. But as far as I know, she's the first introduction to this sort of battle structure. And her dungeon is a castle. So basically the way that the game sets it up, and feel free to correct me if I miss anything, is that when you watch the Midnight Channel, you will see the shadow of the person who's been cast into the TV, and that will sort of give you an idea of what their dungeon is going to be like. In Yukiko's case, it is a castle, because her shadow is trying to find her Prince Charming, who will take her away from this life. And that is the shadow that Yukiko needs to confront. It is her resentment for having a future that has already been decided for her as the proprietor of this inn, and she wants somebody to come and take her away from that. Which, again, I thought was very interesting, especially because the game sort of hints that Chie is, I think, is supposed to be that person for her at the time. And so Yukiko's story, I obviously did not identify with it as much as Chie and Yosuke's, but I thought was still very interesting. Kelly, what were your thoughts on Yukiko?
Yukiko is probably closest to me in real life. So basically the introverted with the very goofy side. And that's one thing I did like about Yukiko is the fact that she would just bust out laughing whenever someone would put on the glasses with the nose on it and everything else, and just showing that goofy side. Also her cooking skills. I'd like to think I'm a better cook than that, but you never know. But yeah, I related to Yukiko just being that introverted, but still wanting to get out there, have lots of friends, and have that group setting.
Awesome. And yeah, I think a lot of girls, I would assume, would be able to identify with a character like that, especially the fact that, like you said, she is introverted, but she's still got a goofy side. She still wants to go out and have friends. And, again, the more time you spend with these characters, the more they continue to evolve. They don't just remain one note throughout the whole story. You keep learning things about them as we go. What about you, Paul? What are your thoughts on Yukiko?
Not as much as the other characters. The main thing I can say about Yukiko is that at first, I guess I would have called her bland. But as the story went on and, things started developing, I liked her more and more. And I think she serves a really good purpose in the game. She's just, very warm. Doesn't appear to be at first because of her introverted nature. I think a lot of people who are introverts have issues in social situations where people might think they're cold, or uninterested in everybody else, where in fact they're, just kind of shy. So the fact that she gets comfortable with the investigation team and this goofy side comes out, the giggling and all that, I definitely warmed up to her by the end.
Yeah. I do have to apologize to Kelly because admittedly, Yukiko of the female characters in the game is probably my least favorite. But
hey,
she's like the best.
She's still not my favorite, but I just relate with her better.
Yeah, but she is the best healer in the game for sure, hands down.
What Arnie was trying to say, I think, is that he likes her the least, therefore he doesn't like you.
Oh, I see.
And this is how this episode ends. Just smash cut to like
go in a corner and cry now.
The end music, yeah. Oh, right. So I think that takes us, and obviously once Yukiko joins your party, you have your first full set of 4 party characters. So at this point, you have your first full party. And I think that is a good time to sort of take a break. We'll be right back to talk about the rest of the party members. And we're back. All right. So, moving right along, we now find ourselves about to talk about probably the most intriguing character in the game, at least in my opinion. I think that when I first played the game, I didn't really, I wasn't too interested in this character. But as I've sort of replayed the game and as I've gotten older, he's just become like probably my favorite character in this game, and that is Kanji Tatsumi. So Kanji's a very interesting character. He's an underclassman to the other members of the team, so he's 1 year younger than them. You are first introduced to Kanji as a delinquent who a lot of people perceive as a bully, and he is the second member of the investigation team to be thrown into the TV world. So Kanji's dungeon is a bathhouse. Kanji was sort of a controversial character because, and if you've played the game, you know exactly why. But for those of you that haven't, Kanji's shadow is portrayed as essentially a stereotypically gay man. So very effeminate, very flamboyant. And from what I've learned through research, his shadow was supposed to represent his hatred of girls who criticized him for enjoying sewing. His mother owns a textile shop, if I'm not mistaken, and so Kanji's very good at sewing. He likes to sew, and he was made fun of it. He was made fun of because of that. And he also does have an interest in boys. there was obviously some controversy with this. And I do have a quote that I'd like to read for the show. Basically regarding, Yu Namba, who was the project lead for, Persona 4 in the US. And this is what he said regarding Kanji. He said, "It's true that Kanji's shadow self initially acts quite flamboyant, but that becomes understandable once you take into account the fact that the other selves are TV show personalities. Be it Yukiko, Kanji, Rise, or Naoto, their other selves act out their characters to entertain their audience, the viewers of the Midnight Channel, and draw their attention. When Kanji confronts his other self, the shadow acts more genuine and personal, focusing on Kanji's internal struggle and insecurity. And the same can be said for the other members of the investigation team. That's why no changes were made in the script. These scenes depict the contrast between what people appear to be and how they really are." There's an additional quote by Namba where he says, "We would like everyone to play through the game and come up with their own answers to the question." And that question essentially being is whether they think Kanji is gay or not. Namba says there is no official answer. "What matters is that Kanji's other self cries out, 'Accept me for who I am.' I think that's a powerful message which many, if not all of us, can relate to." So Kanji is definitely a complicated character, to say the least. And I think that what Namba is saying is true. When you play the game, you'll notice that the shadows of the characters act a lot differently when they're sort of on, as in when they're on the Midnight Channel before you confront them. Once you actually confront them, they are a lot more serious and really get a lot more into what that particular character's struggle is. But I think that I'd like to get, before I sort of go into what I think about Kanji, I'd like to get your guys' opinion on him, because this is something that I don't think is dealt with a lot, especially in the form of video games. So Kelly, what did you think about just in general Kanji and all of this and how it was handled by the people who made Persona 4?
Well, when I played it, what the bathhouse part is where I first started to realize, hey, they're not going to censor this game. And that was a big step forward, because if you ever played the first Persona or the second one, they cut out the entire first half of Persona 2 and didn't bring it to the West because they didn't want to have the controversy going. So I was very happy to see the fact that they were bringing situations like this up in a video game. For me, I think it's really cool, the fact that they didn't say one way or another. Is he gay? Is he not gay? Does it really matter? And for this character, what it is it's a guy who likes to sew. Do we have to feed into the stereotype that sewing is for women and for gay guys? Let's have him straight and like sewing, it's fine either way. So I'm just very happy this character exists, whether he's bi, whether he's straight, whether he's gay. He's a great character, and I just loved seeing that sweet guy that was inside this really rough exterior. And he could still throw down great insults throughout the entire game.
Hell yeah. What about you, Paul? What did you think about Kanji?
Well, it's very, very similar to what Kelly said. I mean, first of all, I'd never seen a character like this before in a video game. Not even close, really. And it, like, at first, he's kind of this one-dimensional dude. He's kind of almost this bully, this really gruff guy. And then once you start kind of peeling back the layers, oh my goodness, like, it's so much deeper and more complex than anything I had seen in a game before. And I mean, like, is he gay? Is he straight? Whatever, right? Like, what I really think they nailed in this game is, and maybe it's unintentional, I don't know, but like, I think our society, and this is just my opinion, but I think our society is kind of, not obsessed, but they definitely put a lot on pigeonholing sexuality, right? Either, you're straight, or you're gay, or you're bi, and you have to have this label, when sexuality is so much more complex than, these very easy labels that we like to put on. So you have a guy like Kanji, right? And I mean, he likes sewing, he likes fashion, he likes all these traditionally feminine hobbies. He appears to like boys, but, later on I don't remember if it's in this game or in the spin-offs, you know, he appears to have a thing for Naoto, who's a girl, but, you know, she also dresses like a boy. And it's, you know, like, we don't have to pigeonhole this dude, right? What it comes down to is that he's very human. He has all these feelings. He has no fucking clue what to do with them. You know, he's a teenager. He doesn't know what's going on. So he puts on this gruff, you know, really tough exterior to cover all these insecurities. And I think it's just fantastic. You know, really, really well written, well presented character. I have all day for Kanji.
Yeah. And to make things very uninteresting, I agree with both of you. So, you know, it really was a thing when the first time I played this game, I really don't think the impact of what I was seeing really made sense to me, you know, in the sense that obviously I'd never seen a character like this before. I'd never seen a game sort of so directly deal with these sorts of things before. So that was big. But as a character, I really didn't sort of get Kanji the first time I went through the game. I think as I replayed it and as I grew, especially having friends who've had similar situations, you know, it's crazy. I mean, I put in my notes here that it was an interesting decision by Atlus to not change the content of this character for the Western release, because historically, we've seen that, you know, all the way back to Nintendo. Things like this get censored a lot of the time. A lot of stuff that game creators, developers put into games in Japan don't make it over here, you know? And with a series like Persona that's already dealing with so much stuff, you know, you got demons, you got, you know, all these other characters that have, you know, real problems that are, you know, identifiable. I think that it was brave, you know, it was brave of them to keep a character in there, or at least not change it because they were afraid that, you know, that a Western audience wouldn't be receptive to something like this. I think that they showed that they think their audience, and the people they are appealing to with these types of games are capable and are willing to look at characters like Kanji and, you know, sort of accept that struggle, accept, you know, these real issues. And I think it made the game a lot more powerful and a lot more impactful, even on people like me who can't necessarily identify with these specific problems. So yeah, I love Kanji. And just to take the heaviness out of the room for a second, I don't have it up, but original sketches for Kanji had him rocking a pompadour, which I thought was amazing, and I kind of wish they had kept it.
Yeah, no kidding. You know, the other thing I wonder about Kanji and just the overall themes in the game, like this is a game that was released pretty late in the PS2's life cycle.
Yeah.
I think it came out about a year after the PS3 was released. And so the PS2 at this point is, you know, borderline afterthought. I wonder if that helped, you know, that they're able to kind of slip this under the radar, so to speak, so that you have the hardcore fans or people who are interested in this kind of genre and they're not really, you know what I mean? Like it's not carrying the torch for the system, so to speak.
I mean, I could see that. I think you could also say, you know, Atlus was not a big publisher at the time. So all these releases were small numbered releases. I think they were sort of able to get away with a lot more because of that. They weren't necessarily the AAA mainstream companies that, you know, Sony would have been concerned about. And I think, you know, having it on a Sony console, I think historically Sony has been better about these kinds of things than Nintendo or Microsoft's not done anything. I think Nintendo's the one that historically has done a lot more censoring of games. But I think, you know, whatever it was, I'm glad that it was there, because Kanji is awesome. And I don't think he would have had, I think that having a story like this really sets him apart and makes him a very impactful character in the game. You know, and it was awesome. I think that, you know, obviously the controversy, I think more comes from the depiction of the shadow, but I do think that is the way that Namba explains it, I think makes perfect sense. You know, shadows are not necessarily the true reflection of the person that, you know, they are. It's sort of something you have to confront, but the shadow sort of tries to bring attention to that negativity. So I think it makes sense for them to be sort of more bombastic and more, you know, out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so moving on from Kanji, we are moving to another interesting character, Rise Kujikawa. I know a lot of people really, really like Rise. I don't. But
oh no.
But it's okay because she's not part of the actual party. She's just around. So Rise is a Japanese pop idol. She becomes tired of, you know, the trials and tribulations of being a pop idol in Japan, and decides to move to Inaba to live with her grandmother, who I believe owns a tofu shop in the game. Shortly after arriving in Inaba, she is kidnapped, so she's now the third member of the investigation team who's thrown into the TV world. She then confronts her shadow, which represents her anger at being stereotyped as an airhead pop star and a sex symbol. Her dungeon, and honestly, coming off the heels of Kanji, I wonder if this wasn't as controversial because of that. But her dungeon is essentially a, like, strip club or a brothel. So clearly not letting off the gas, you know, on the controversy train here. But yeah, so Rise's, sort of dungeon is that, you know, and she obviously becomes part of the investigation team after coming to terms with that. Rise, I thought, you know, was an interesting character. My only problem is that, and I don't know if Persona 4 sort of conditioned me at this point to be expecting this, but by the time I got to Rise and I saw her shadow, I kind of knew exactly where the game was going with it. So while I did think that her story was interesting, I don't think it was as impactful as the other character stories that I had played up to that point. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I kind of agree. You know, you'd think I would have identified the trend at this point in the game, but for whatever reason, I just hadn't. You know, like, I didn't really like Rise at first. She was kind of the stereotypical, you know, and a little bit unrealistic. I mean, look, I'm talking about realism in a game where there's a hidden TV world and you go through a TV to get there. So, you know, the fact that she's this pop star who goes back to school, you know, it didn't really resonate with me. But of course, because it's Persona 4, the layers start getting peeled back, and she's a much deeper and, you know, character who I can empathize with a lot more. You know, not my favorite in the game, but there are no bad characters in this game, so to speak. Yeah, she's pretty great.
All right. So, Kelly, I do want to get your opinions on Rise, because I think she might be one of, if not your favorite character.
She is my favorite character for Persona 4. I actually have a couple of figures of her around the house here. So, while Yukiko is probably who I am most like, Rise is who I'd more like to be. So, just that, having that extroverted side, that get up and go, get what she wants. She's like the only girl in the game who will say, hey, you, I like you. Why don't we, you know, go out? That type of thing. And just having that extrovertedness, and also the pop star idol part, I can relate to that. I know not in a real sense, but just the fact of having that, you know, wanting everyone to like you, you know, wanting to be out there, but at the same time wanting to be able to pull back and have that private life. And I liked seeing that contrast between the two. The fact that when she was outside of the pop star world, just the fact that she was jealous of the people that were still in it. It's like, but don't forget about me over here. So just bringing that back in, and then seeing at the end and seeing the posters of her in Persona 5, I was just like, oh, look, she got back into it. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know. That was a pretty nice little
that was a nice little touch.
5.
And I think, you know, I will say in defense of Rise on my behalf, she really does. She kind of becomes like the battery for the team. You know, she's sort of that like peppy voice that she's like, come on guys, we can do it. You know, we got to keep going, because, you know, things in the story start getting a little heavier, a little dire, down towards the line. And Rise is, I thought, always that positive edge to the group that sort of kept them going a lot of the time. But yeah, that brings us to a character that, I really don't know what to say about Teddy. Teddy's just Teddy. So I think rewinding back, so Teddy is a character that you do meet, very early on in the game. He is essentially the first thing you see, when Yosuke and you initially enter the TV world. Teddy is a shadow, but he does not remember, where he came from. Teddy essentially agrees to help you find out who is throwing people into the television world, because it's sort of messing with the place he had been inhabiting for so long. It's, just creating problems for him. So Teddy agrees to try to help you out in solving this mystery. But Teddy only becomes a playable member of your party much later on in the game. After you defeat Rise's shadow, Teddy sacrifices himself to save the rest of the party. Essentially what happens is he defeats the shadow, but he's flattened, like literally flattened in the process.
In a very cartoony manner.
Yeah.
It's pretty great.
And so tying into the story at the time, when Rise confronts her shadow and it becomes a part of her, she declares that there is no real her. And so this causes Teddy's shadow to manifest itself due to a fear of his existence being superficial and hollow. So Teddy's basic issue is that he doesn't know where he comes from, and he wants to feel like he belongs and he exists. So after you defeat Teddy's shadow, which is very strange that he even has a shadow, considering that he is a shadow.
Yeah.
But whatever. He gains his own persona, and he becomes a active party member while Rise takes over his supporting role that he had been in before this. And then that's when things sort of take a turn. So if you've never played Persona 4, Teddy is kind of the unofficial mascot of Persona 4. He is just a giant teddy bear. At one point early in the story, his head is removed, and it's found that he is empty inside. He is just a bare suit. But after he gains a persona, he grows a human body inside of his bear suit. I'm going to say that one more time. He grows a human body inside of a bear costume.
Dude, only in Japan.
Which has the added benefit of allowing him to leave the television world, so he can interact with the party outside, like in the regular, in the town of Inaba, where he lives with Yosuke, and he gets a job working at Junes as sort of their little mascot. Teddy is probably the strangest part of a very strange game, in my opinion. I do appreciate the struggle that he goes through and the story that he has, just as, it's probably the most identifiable, just feeling like you don't belong, feeling like you want to know what you're meant for, what you're meant to do. But as a character, I just could never get along with Teddy very long. I don't think the bear puns helped. Also, but, so overall, Teddy is a very interesting character that I don't think is characterized very well, at least for me, if that makes any sense. What about you, Kelly? What do you think of Teddy?
Well, obviously I couldn't relate to him very well, but I think he did his job as being like...
You didn't grow your human body out of a bear suit?
It was a pretty cute guy. I don't know. But anyways, for Teddy, I think it was a great narrator for that TV world. You needed something to explain what was going on there at the beginning. So I think Teddy did a really good job there. I also believe that he had one of the best lines in the game for me. I could play it every now and then, and I still laugh out loud at it. Basically, it's when they're doing their cook-off right near the end, and they're getting to all the girls' foods, which is terrible. And he just goes, "Wow, this is awful." And it just made me laugh so hard because he was so enthusiastic about this thing tasting terrible. So, yeah.
Oh, Teddy. Classic fish out of water. What about you, Paul? Do you have any thoughts on Teddy?
I don't really. I thought he was the mascot of the game, and I didn't really have very much for him beyond that. I thought, they tried to give him a little bit more of a backstory, make him a little bit more like the other characters, but it didn't, I don't know, it kind of fell flat for me.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize what Kelly was saying, which is essentially his role early in the game is to be the narrator and to kind of, tell you as the player what this world is and what the rules are, so to speak. So in that regard, he's useful, but mostly he's the mascot. He says, really funny things from time to time. I found him endearing. In Persona Q, one of the spin-offs, he becomes really obnoxious. But that's just, again, my opinion. In P4, I thought he was quite endearing. And it's funny Kelly mentions the laugh out loud moments. That's another thing this game has.
Yeah.
More than any game I had played to this point, were moments where I'm sitting in the game room by myself and I am laughing out loud, right? Like the "this is awful" line, that's hilarious. I don't even remember it until you mentioned it right now, Kelly. Like for me, it was like a knee slapper when they're doing the cross-dressing pageant and the host introduces Yosuke and he says, "And now Yosuke-chan." And like there's something about the way he says Yosuke-chan, like it just, god damn, dude, it slayed me. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Teddy.
Teddy. Teddy. I mean, he's all right. I do agree. I think he gets worse in the spin-offs. But for what he is, I think he does his job admirably.
Yeah.
But not much more than that. And now we get to our final party member, final character, Naoto Shirogane. So Naoto is another very interesting character, one that I really enjoyed when I first played the game. She was my favorite character during my first playthrough. Naoto is a young detective who comes to Inaba to aid the police in solving the murders. So she's sort of not to become super anime-y, but sort of a Detective Conan character, a very like bright young person who solves crimes. She was, much like Kanji, another controversial character, for different reasons, obviously. In her case, it was the choice of the creators to have her dress in a more masculine fashion, despite being female. Naoto is believed to be male by the main characters initially, including Kanji, who develops feelings for her when he believes that she is male, but they appear to remain even after she is revealed to be female to him, which happens, a little bit later on in the story when you learn more about her. And with Naoto, the way she ends up in the TV world is that she appears on television. Basically, at this point in the story, the characters figure out that the connecting link between everybody who's gone missing and been thrown into the television world is that they have appeared on television. Naoto has also figured this out, and so she puts herself on television to allow herself to be kidnapped. Her dungeon is a military base or sort of lab. I'll be honest, and I think this is the perfect time to talk about this with Naoto. The dungeons and the dungeon design in Persona 4 is probably the weakest part of the game for me. I don't know if you guys agree with that.
Absolutely. Random generated. They couldn't put much personality into it, so.
Yeah. And I think Naoto's is probably one of the worst ones, where it's just like a standard sort of military installation. There's not a lot to tie into the character. I think mostly because I think a lot of it is due to her being introduced so late. There's not a lot of time at this point for character development for her. But when she does eventually confront her shadow, you learn that her shadow represents her frustration with being born as a woman and being treated like a child by the police. And basically she sums this all up in what she says after you defeat her shadow. She says, the police department is a male-oriented society. If they had the slightest concrete reason to look down on me, nobody would need me anymore. And this is the reason that Naoto dresses as a boy, is that, you know, she believes that she would not get the respect that, or the trust from the police that she thinks that she deserves by just being clearly a very smart and resourceful person because she is female. Much like Kanji, Naoto's story is also somewhat controversial. And again, I thought that it was a very bold move on Atlas's part to not, like Kelly had said before, not censor any of this and just keep it as is for the Western release. Naoto was, like I said, initially my favorite character in the game, and I really liked her story. You know, it wasn't anything I don't think it was as deep as Kanji's story, because I think Kanji's story stands alone as probably the best sort of line throughout this entire game. But I thought it was well executed. I thought she was a very interesting character, and especially for a character that shows up so late in the game, it's sometimes hard to really care about those characters, because at this point you've spent so much time with all of your other party members that this person rolls in, 60 hours into the game. I thought they did a good job in making her a character that I was interested in, that I wanted to learn more about, even though she showed up a lot later. What are your thoughts on Naoto, Kelly?
Unfortunately, I think she was just introduced a little too late for me. For me, since I did pre-order the game, basically when the game first came out, they tried to keep it really hush-hush that this was a female character. They wanted you to believe this was a male character until you got to that big reveal. Unfortunately, I did get the pre-order art book and decided to leaf through it, so that was spoiled pretty much immediately from there.
Gotcha.
I do like the relationship between her and Kanji, just trying to figure out what was going on there. And the fact that he still remained wanting to like him or her. It was more the person that he liked. That's what I really liked about this character. So unfortunately, what I liked about her was more about another character. And that, even in the spin-offs, I wish they would have brought more characterization to how she was. I don't think I played through her route in the fighting game yet, so maybe there's more there that I'm not sure about.
Yeah, and I will say, and I want to. The reason I want to say this first is I want Paul to address it when he tells me what he thinks about Naoto. I did not know anything about this character going in, but as soon as she was, not immediately, but pretty shortly after she was revealed, I pretty much figured out that she was a girl. So I don't know if, it was supposed to actually be that much of a secret, at least from when I played it, because just based off the character design, I was fairly confident that she was supposed to be a girl. So Paul, what do you think about Naoto? And, did you also think that she was a girl when you first saw her?
Yeah. It's fairly, I don't know. I thought it was pretty evident early on. She has delicate features that one wouldn't associate with a man. The voice, while not feminine, was also not, deep and masculine either. So there were definitely a lot of hints there, I thought anyway. But yeah, I mean, as a character, I concur completely with Kelly, which is that the main thing that makes her fascinating is how she interacts with Kanji, and how Kanji still retains interest in her even though she's a girl, and he's attracted to her at first when he thinks she's a boy. It's just a really interesting situation. Again, talking about my point earlier where we, perhaps try to label sexuality a little bit too easily and readily. And you have this situation where, this guy likes this guy, but then it's a girl and he still likes the girl, and who knows what's going on? Do we even need to know what's going on? The bottom line is he likes her. She's a person that he likes, and that's that. And that's kind of all we really need,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think that wraps up, the main characters, as far as the investigation team goes. We're going to take one last break, I think, and we'll come back and sort of put a nice little bow on this entire Persona 4 discussion. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's see if we can close this out, or if we'll just talk about Persona 4 for 3 more hours. Who knows?
Nothing wrong with that.
Welcome to the Thunderdome, bitches. Like, it's just going down. I'm sorry. All right, so moving on past the main characters, obviously super important, and we've talked about how awesome all of them are, but the awesome thing about Persona 4 is that the main characters are only part of the entire experience. I think that amongst JRPGs, Persona 4 is probably among the best in terms of secondary characters and their impact on the story as well. So I just wanted to highlight what are probably the 2 most important secondary characters, and that is Yu's uncle, Ryotaro Dojima, and his little cousin, Nanako Dojima. So starting with Ryotaro, he is a detective for the Inaba police force who is working the Inaba murder cases. And obviously, as you can imagine, hilarity ensues as he starts to realize that you are sort of involved in this case as well. The way that Persona 4 handles its secondary characters that I don't think we've talked about yet is every character is assigned a arcana based on tarot cards, and you interact with all your secondary characters while you're outside of combat, and this includes other party members as well as random characters throughout the town, including Dojima and Nanako. And the way, as you interact with them, you learn more about their story, and you create social links, which become stronger and give you bonuses in combat and stuff like that. What you learn about Dojima as you interact with him is that his wife, who's Nanako's mother, was killed in a hit-and-run accident, which essentially left him as a single parent. He is obsessed with the case and trying to find the person who killed his wife, to the point where he ends up neglecting his daughter. And so as you interact with him, you sort of learn that Dojima is afraid of seeing Nanako because she reminds him so much of his wife. But he works through that to ultimately do what's best for his family and spend more time with his daughter. Again, extremely heavy, sort of subtext here. No
kidding.
That is,
yeah.
Especially as when I was playing this when I was 17, this sort of stuff was beyond me. In the medium of video games, I was like, I'm used
unthinkable.
Going around beating up monsters, having a good old time, not talking about, the trials and tribulations of parental death on the psyches of young children and their parents. But no, Dojima, I really grew to really like this character. Your typical gruff sort of policeman, stereotype, but much like Kanji, you sort of start digging at that exterior and you find this very rich, interesting character underneath it all. Kelly, what did you think about Dojima and his sort of impact on the story?
Dojima, for me, basically, since I was older when I played it, I could relate to the adult part of it. So I liked seeing an adult that while he was kind of absent, he was still there. He was still a loving parent. He wasn't neglectful in a he didn't mean to be neglectful. He still loved his daughter. He still loved his nephew, even bringing him into his home for a year. So I liked seeing that instead of the absentee parent that you don't even see in the game. Like the other characters, we don't really know too much about their parents. They're not really there. They're letting these kids run wherever, really. So just having someone there to say, what are you doing? Why are you a part of this investigation? You know, you're a kid. Why are you trying to, let us take care of it? And then after what happens to Nanako, just having him break down and say, if you can do something, please do something for my daughter. So I liked seeing that in a character, in a grown-up character, in a Japanese video game where usually it's just the teenagers and you don't see any of the parental figures at all.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. What about you, Paul?
I loved him. I think he's fantastic. I mean, the fact that he's an adult is helpful because I'm an adult. But, he could have been like a one-trick pony, right?
Yeah.
Much like every other character in this game, he's not just the guy who is focused on finding his wife's, murderer, right? Ostensibly a murderer. It could have just been that. It could have just been some, a cop and he's looking after you and that's all there is to it. But then, there's his feelings for Nanako and the fact that he's worried he's neglecting her. But he still has this obsession with looking for his wife's killer. Like, man, it's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And, a great advertisement for how good looking stubble looks on a guy, I think. Like, he is a dashing gentleman.
Yeah, he's definitely, yeah, you're right. I agree.
The loose tie, that's how I want to wear it.
The Dojima cosplay is going to be the next wave of older gentleman cosplay. But yeah, so moving on, obviously playing off of Dojima is Nanako, who is your cousin. And she, really does become one of my favorite characters. Going from the very moment you meet her, she's very charming. Her story arc obviously revolves around her father, in that you start to notice this very subtly as the game sort of starts up. You notice that she's home alone a lot. She takes care of a lot of the chores around the house, doing the laundry, washing, cleaning up, doing all that sort of stuff, because her father
she is incredibly capable.
Yes. Sure.
Like, I can't remember how old she is in the game. I'll peg her between 10 and 12.
Yeah.
Dude, she's doing stuff that at 25, I was like, I don't know how to wash clothes or whatever.
She essentially runs the household when Dojima is not around, And, through your interactions with her, what you learn is that she doesn't know. She starts to question whether her dad loves her, because he's not at home a lot due to work. And obviously he was very impacted by, her mother's death. As was she, and so what I think Kelly was alluding to before, is that later into the game, Nanako is kidnapped and she is also thrown into the TV world. You manage to get her out, and she's taken to the hospital where she eventually passes away in what has to, for me, one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in any video game. Personally, forget about Aerith getting stabbed through the heart by a Sephiroth. Forget the opera scene in Final Fantasy VI. None of that. This is where it was at for me. And this is really when you're confronted with a choice. So at this point, you know who put her in the television world, and you capture him, and you're given the choice of sparing his life, or not. I don't think it's ever revealed how exactly you go about essentially killing him, I believe. And it was very strange because you were given a couple of text choices throughout the game, but nothing really significant. And at this point, you're given this choice, and if you choose to not spare him, your game just ends. You're given a game over, essentially. And this was really strange for me because up to this point, the game was sort of on this path, just sort of going along with the story. And I don't know, this was just super weird that they would give you this choice that if you make the wrong choice, it just sort of game overs you. And if you haven't saved, then you got to reload and get back up to that point. I don't know. Did you? It kind of bothered me when this happened. Do you guys have any thoughts on all this, Kelly?
What really bothers me is that I know some people who got that ending and then said, "I'm done."
Yeah,
it was absolutely crazy. They I've seen enough. I'm done with this game now. So I just couldn't believe that they would leave Nanako dead, and it's just like, why would you not go back?
I know, it's just such a kick to the gut, all of this, especially if you haven't been saving diligently.
Yeah, mechanically it's not a good thing to have in the game where you have to go and replay all the stuff that, who knows when you save, right? So having to go back and do that's definitely a bit of a gut punch. But as far as the whole scenario goes, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit of kind of a moral sledgehammer where if you choose to kill this guy, then she dies. But if you do the right thing and let the police handle it, then Nanako lives.
Yep.
We can look at it that way, I suppose.
Yeah. And I will not argue with the fact that her dying was very impactful.
Oh, dude, her whole character, man, when Nanako gets kidnapped, she's in danger, real danger. And it's not danger of getting a bad grade or something if she doesn't finish an assignment. She might be murdered in a very grisly and public fashion, right? And I'm playing this game and I know I have to go to bed because I have to go to work the next day, but I can't because Nanako is in fucking danger. Yeah. And if I just explain that to my boss the next day, he'll understand. But I've never...
You don't understand, sir.
Well,
this was an emergency.
Nanako was in trouble.
What was weird for me is
call out sick the next day.
I'm not usually one for the child characters. Usually I find them extremely annoying, or they'll have some weird quirk or something else. And for Nanako, it's just
agreed.
This character is amazing. She's hardworking. She loves her father. She loves her. She's just a great character all around. I didn't find any annoyances with her like I normally do with these child characters.
Yeah. Not even.
No, she's very warm. All she wants is to go to Junes and enjoy that kotatsu,
yes.
Yep.
right? She's just very warm, very likable.
Yeah. Not even her singing the Junes theme several hundred times throughout this game got me to dislike her. And I'm assuming that you will be playing that song at some point in this episode. And this is what I will say in defense of, well, not in defense, but the thing that really got me about Nanako is that at this point, you've sort of been doing the same formula over and over again, right? You meet a new character, they get kidnapped, they're on the TV, you go on the TV, you beat the shadow, get a new party member. Cool. And sort of as it's winding down, you're getting towards the end of the game, but the people outside of your circle of party members, the secondary characters that you interact with and you have relationships with, they feel like they're sort of in this bubble where these people aren't in danger because you have to interact with them. You have to sort of be able to speak to them and, have a relationship with them. And Nanako getting kidnapped is sort of somebody bursting through that bubble and just being fuck you. And, doing something completely unexpected in taking her and throwing her into the television world. It caught me off guard after so many times of me being I know exactly what's going to happen now and now and now. It was just another sort of curve.
Yeah, no, I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah.
It's unexpected and it's sadly, and sad, it's a fictional character, but sadly it is the perfect character to throw in there because everybody loves Nanako and it creates that sense of urgency, right? So, hey, great on them.
Yeah.
It's a great idea.
All right. So, now we got to talk about, I've kept saying that the story is so important, the story. But if there was something else that was going to be the best part of this entire game that's not the story, it's going to be the music. The music
yeah, dude.
to this game is so freaking great because of how different it is from everything else. And I keep coming back to the other RPGs of this time that I grew up playing and that I had played before and stuff like that. This is like completely out of left field in terms of what I'm used to in video game music for something like this. It was composed by Shoji Meguro, who began his career at Atlus with Revelations Persona. So he has been working on these games for a very long time. I think if we want to point out one track that I think is definitely a staple of the Persona series, it has to be Aria of the Soul. I think that it's been used in multiple games. His first time leading as composer was on Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne or Shin Megami Tensei 3. But his big break finally came when he composed the soundtrack to Persona 3, which is also an amazing soundtrack. And I cannot say enough good things about the music in this game. Do you guys have any favorite tracks, Paul?
Well, I mean, Reach Out to the Truth, right? Like it's so peppy and so positive, and it's just the best battle music you could have for this game. That would be my favorite, and then honorable mention to the theme in like when the staging area for the TV world.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the song is called, but you know what I'm talking about. And Your Affection, I don't know what it is that made me laugh like every time I heard it. There's a little bit of the in some of these songs, there's a little bit of the Japanese person singing in English, and so it doesn't quite translate. And so Your Affection for me became this happy, peppy song where I was just kind of making up the lyrics as I went along because I couldn't understand what they were trying to say, and my lyrics were always hilarious. And so every time Your Affection came up, it was wildly enjoyable.
How about you, Kelly? Any favorite tracks?
Just right when you open your opening song.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That one, it might be because I had that disc problem, too. Just seeing it boot up for the first time, I was like, oh, thank God, this works. But I would always just let it play through, but every time I boot up the game, just say, get excited for playing the game again.
Yeah. I would do that also, is let the song just play. It's such a good song. For me, it has to be Reach Out to the Truth is amazing. Just the fact that, the battle music is great, especially in an RPG where 90% of what you're doing is fighting. Having battle music that I don't get tired of is always a good thing.
They have to nail that.
Yeah,
have to nail it.
You have to.
It's so important.
And then special shout out to the end credit song. I believe it's called Nevermore, for destroying my heart the first time I heard it. Just the worst, but also the best. And then one other thing I wanted to touch on that we briefly discussed at the beginning of the episode. Persona 4 did receive a enhanced, I don't want to say remake, but I guess is an enhanced port for the PlayStation Vita called Persona 4 Golden. I haven't played enough of it to be able to comment on it, but I know Kelly has played it. So what would you say, how does Persona 4 Golden compare to Persona 4 on the PS2?
By far, I would say it is definitely worth a second playthrough to play the Persona 4 Golden. Okay. Some people say it is the reason to have a Vita. You could see how much more love they put into the game, into this, I wouldn't even call it a port. They just added so much things. So you have a new character. You have Marie. Mm-hmm. She lives basically in the limousine when you start, and you go with the social link through her. You see her out in the world interacting with your squad mates and just becoming more and more human as she's out there. And then if you get it for Persona 4 Golden, having a walkthrough is almost a must because some of the things that are added you just want to see. So you have a new dungeon because of her. You want to see how that's going to end. You have a new ending. The true end of Persona 4 Golden, I was just like, okay, these characters are wrapped up. We get to see what happens to them. I can't remember if it's 6 months or a year later, but you get to see them again. You see how they've grown, and you just get that send-off feeling of, wow, this is over, but this is a great send-off for these characters. There's a whole bunch of new cutscenes. So you've got a concert that happens with Rise involved, of course. And you've got new vacation scenes. There's a summer vacation. There's a winter vacation with whoever your best girl is. You get to have a winter scene with them. They just added so much content that it's worth another 100 hours of playthrough just to see it all. I was just amazed at how much they added to this game.
The fact that there is another ending immediately sells this for me as something I need to, at least, if not play through again, just watch on YouTube. Because the ending of the original game just gutted me. Because you know what happens? You leave. The year is over, and then you leave.
But you gotta play Persona 4 Dancing All Night then.
Absolutely.
Because then...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's another one. I haven't been able to get my hands on it. Actually, no, I did buy it recently, so I do need to play that one as well.
Oh, yeah, you totally do.
But yeah, no, I mean, there have been so many spin-offs. Persona Q, which is the Etrian Odyssey 3DS version, which is a crossover between P3 and P4. Arena, which is the fighting game. Arena Ultimax. Persona 4 Golden. I mean, if you like Persona 4, there's plenty to sink your teeth into after the main game for sure.
And it's funny, like before the show when we were chatting with Kelly, and I was like, I think I don't really want. I don't need Persona 4 Golden. Like I have a Vita, I have tons of games for it. Golden's not one of them, and hearing you now expound on it like that, Kelly, I'm like, well, I gotta fucking get this game. Like,
Yeah.
It's definitely worth it.
And I mean, there's never, I've played through the game at least twice. I think maybe 3 times. And it holds up, coming back to those characters, at least for me, every time I start playing this game, it's like it's the first time all over again. I instantly just fall back in love with every single one of them. Even knowing what's going to happen does not take away from the impact that the story has on you. And speaking of that, that was sort of my closing question for this episode was, what is the impact of Persona 4, either on just a personal standpoint or on, video games as a whole, if there's anything that, it's impacted. So Paul, why don't you give us your take?
The impact, you know what? I don't know about the impact on the industry per se, other than perhaps a sort of like a bridge to more adult, more mature content in games and JRPGs in general. And even adult's not quite the word. More deep and more complex characterization, I think, is where I'm going with that. And I mean, for me personally, I mean, what can I say, right? It's the game that kind of got me back into gaming. Like, I hadn't played anything like it before. I went into it with very little in the way of expectations, and it just blew me away. Those characters, at the end of the day, the story's great. It unfolds in a very organic way. It's very well written, but it's those characters, you can't help but fall in love with them. And that's kind of what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Kelly? I'm very interested to hear your take on this.
Well, for me, it was the second Persona game I played. So, while that first one, Persona 3, really did have the deeper impact for me versus Persona 4, for me, Persona 4 was more of this isn't just a one-trick pony. This series is solid. They spent so much time on it. I mean, the gap between Persona 4 and Persona 5 was huge, but they still had that quality. So, just having Persona 4 is that this series is absolutely on top of its game, and hopefully it will continue to be so. That's what Persona 4 means to me, is that quality is there. The series is not going to go down in quality anytime soon.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think because of the time when I played it, and where I was as a gamer, as a person, Persona 4, I think, is really my last memory of what I would consider last childhood memory of a game. It's a game that really sticks in my mind, and I have very fond memories of, much like the games I played when I was very young and started video gaming. Persona 4 is, it had an incredible impact on me and the kinds of games that I've enjoyed going forward. So I can't say enough good things about it. So it's probably a terrible idea for me to host this particular episode, because I will not shut up about this game ever. And so I think that probably takes us to the final things that we want to talk about with Persona 4, and that is, personally, where does Persona 4 rank for you as far as JRPGs or just in general video games? I guess in your personal ranking, where does Persona 4 stand, Kelly?
Unfortunately, Persona 3 still has my heart. Yeah.
Oh.
Don't get me wrong. Persona 4 I can play over and over again. It's a great RPG. Persona is definitely my favorite series of RPGs. When the new one gets announced, I get super excited. These characters, Rise has a great place in my heart. All these characters do. Nanako being an amazing character too. I'll always think of her as probably the best child character in any video game. But yeah, unfortunately, Persona 3 for me is the top.
That's not unfortunate. It's just, it is what it is.
What about you, Paul? Where does Persona 4 rank for you?
Well, it's funny, right? Like we talked about this on the Mega Man episode, right? When we were talking about, we were having kind of that debate, Mega Man 2 and Mega Man 3.
Yeah.
And I suspected that if Mega Man 3 was the first one I played, that would have been my favorite, but it was 2, right? And so one can say the same thing about Persona. I haven't played Persona 3, but I have played 5. And while 5 is a superior game in most ways, 4 is still my favorite. And I think Persona 4, like, just with the depth of the characters and the likability and the positive vibe, you have yellow as that kind of thematic color. It's really nice and bright.
Yep.
Man, it's just such a positive game. I think it's the best JRPG ever. But that's just one silly Canadian's opinion.
Well, you can add my opinion to that as well. I think Persona 4 stands above any other RPG I've ever played. Obviously, I haven't beaten 3. But, like you said, I played through 5, and mechanically, 5 is the superior Persona game. But just in terms of the characters, the story, and just the overall atmosphere, world, whatever word you want to use for it, I think Persona 4 is, in a league of its own in terms of RPGs and just general video games, in terms of storytelling and what developers were willing to do and what they were willing to give to players to experience. I think Persona 4 is unmatched in that regard. So I would probably call it the best RPG, the best JRPG that I've ever played. And I think with that, we're ready to close out. Quick fire question for both of you. Favorite Persona girl and Persona guy. Paul.
Chie, and it's gotta be, I want to say Yosuke just to disagree with you guys and stick it to you. But, no, it's Chie and Kanji.
All right. How about you, Kelly?
We got Kanji and we've got Rise.
All right. And for me, it is also Kanji. And I want to say Chie because she is best girl. But I'm going to say Nanako because, at the end of the day, I think Nanako is the best. So that's going to do it for us. We are the Region Free Gamers. Special thanks to Kelly for joining us today. Thank you so much for being on this episode and rambling along with us for a little bit.
Oh, thanks for letting me talk about one of my favorite games. Loved it.
Anytime.
I know, right? Like, I don't need an excuse to talk about Persona 4.
But yeah, so this has been our time. Thank you guys so much for listening. Like we said at the top of the show, please, go to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. It really helps us get noticed and helps bring in new listeners to the show. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. You can listen to us on Spotify or any other podcasting app that you use. And obviously, we are at on Instagram at Region Free Gamer. So make sure to go down there and give us a follow, and, you know, just come interact with us, hang out. We do stuff all the time. Paul, where can people find you?
On Instagram, Pauls_gamer.
Awesome. What about yourself, Kelly?
Mostly on Instagram, so Sierra_gaming.
Awesome. You can find me mostly on the Region Free Gamers Instagram, but I also have a personal Instagram at Welcome to the Game. It's at Welcome, the number 2, the game. And that's where you can find me sometimes. Thank you guys so much, and have an awesome day. Bye.
Thanks.